Sorry, everyone. I've had to use every last possible minute this morning. It's been busy already. All right. I think it's noon. I think we can get going.
Right on the dot.
Right on the dot. So this morning, Joan and I are going to be going over rentals and working with landlords and with tenants. I guess I just want to start off by saying, this is not a common practice. We don't want to discourage you from working with tenants or with landlords, of course. It's just not as cut and dry as listing and as listing property for sale and procuring homes for buyers. So, bear with me. Please ask questions. A lot of this information is tips that I got from John Molitor back in the day. I mean, also just kind of working out my own kind of processes as I started working with more tenants and working with more landlords. So, all right. And actually, I'm gonna minimize this screen because I'm gonna have to go back and forth quite a bit between platforms. So let's start off with working with tenants. So the required paperwork at minimum is going to be the tenant representation agreement. And this is just like a buyer agency agreement. And actually this verbiage used to be found within the buyer agency agreement. And I think, right, Joan, it was last year when they separated the two. So now the tenant representation agreement is its own standing agreement. And then, like with any client or customer, we still need to have the ABA disclosure and the KW disclosure, which you guys should all be familiar with. I'm going to go over to zip forms to show you what the tenant representation agreement looks like. And again, it's very similar, as you can see, to the buyer agency agreement. It's the WB 39. You're acting as the exclusive authority, or giving us the exclusive authority to act as the tenant's rep. In line 10, you would fill in the rent range. So, if their budget is up to $3,000 per month for a lease, you could put those parameters in there. And again, just like a buyer agency agreement, there's excluded properties you could name on lines 17 and on lines 22. 31 through 33 is where we indicate compensation. And this is kind of where I kind of feel like it is the Wild West, where we don't have a set commission. We don't have a minimum commission that you guys need to charge. I think what's typical is 1 month's rent. And I say that though the last tenant I worked with, their budget was $4,200 a month, and I only ended up collecting $1,000. So it's really, I think it's really a case by case basis. I think at minimum you'd want to charge at least $1,000. And another thing that you're going to be kind of feeling out is, and actually this is going to be changing. So oftentimes when you're working with a landlord who has listed property in the MLS, listed their rental opportunities in the MLS, that compensation I've seen be as little as 20% of a 1 month's rent. So, if you're working with, $3,000 per month, that's $600 that you would be compensated. So I think what I would like you guys to hear here is that, I think I would try and get $1,000 at least. Have conversations with me or Joan if you do want to work out something else. But again, this is the potential tenant who is agreeing to compensate you. So, and just like buried within the buyer agency agreement, it does state that we may collect commission from the listing agent, the listing firm, or the lessor or the landlord right here on 48. But it should be assumed, the rhetoric should be, tenant, you are paying me unless I am able to collect compensation from another party, which either would be the listing firm or the seller, right? Any questions on that? Okay. And then again, just like in the buyer agency agreement, we've got sections on the firm's duties, cooperation, disclosure to clients, verbiage, which you guys should all be familiar with. Multiple representation is also addressed here. Concept of subagency. But again, like I said, this is all almost identical to the buyer agency agreement. You would put in the terms of the contract, sorry, the date terms on 286, and everyone would sign. Any questions so far? Okay. So working with tenants in practice. So this is where I feel like we could have an open dialogue, and especially if anyone has had experience already working with tenants, but I'm just gonna describe how I've always treated it. You know, when I have a potential tenant, and that's kind of acting as a partner with them. I always let them know, like, you're gonna tap into your own resources as well. You know, you're still gonna look at Craigslist, you're still gonna look at Zillow. And then this is where you could name an exclusion on that tenant representation agreement. You know, if a tenant is able to procure a apartment or a flat by themselves, perhaps you want to work out with them that they don't have to compensate you if they found that on their own. You know, maybe you are going to put in a fee for any gas that you might have used, you know, something like to that effect. It really is, we're a lot more flexible, I guess, on how you can treat this client or this client. So I've always, again, like I've always said, when it comes to a tenant, I will get a buyer or a tenant representation agreement signed. But I will indicate that if they do find something on their own, they do not need to pay me. You would use Craigslist, Zillow, Apartment Finder, etc. The MLS search. So just like you're setting up your buyer for a property search, you can set up your tenant for an apartment search. If you can see here, residential rental is a category here. So let's say I've got somebody looking in the east side. So I've got 33 properties, and I would set them up on a subscription the same way that I would a regular buyer. 42,000. We've got a lot of RNC listings in here already. Any questions about this? Okay, I'll give you an example of kind of the information that so 2-bedroom, 1.5 bath. It's an apartment style, obviously, 1 story. It indicates whether there's assigned spaces or surface, the type of parking, if there's a storage unit. Here we go. Sub-agent commission is $100 on this. So this could also kind of help inform how much time you want to invest in tenant business, excuse me. I've always usually treated it as, if I've got friends who are coming to me who need help, that's usually who I'm working with. So, okay. Again, any questions?
Yeah, I'd just like to add in here, John Molitor does a lot in rentals. I think a lot of you know, he came from Apartments Finder, one of those companies, before he came to me. He does it on a huge scale because he treats it as a separate business, separate from his residential sales business. He works a lot with investors. He works a lot with ownerships. Um, he researches and searches all of these possible tenants and actually owners of rental properties. So he makes it into a big business and does a lot. It's really the only way to make money in rentals is
Mm-hmm.
do it in quantity as he does. Because otherwise, as Steph said, do it for a friend, do it occasionally. It, keeps you alert to the market, but don't think of this as a way to drive your income.
Yeah. And to tack on to Joni's example of John too, I mean, yes, it is large scale. And then also, I mean, he kind of goes in with the mindset that these tenants are going to be potential buyers someday too. So, and that, the willingness to work with a tenant, having that thought in mind, that would still drive motivation to work with a tenant, knowing that they could be a buyer someday, right? So, just under the veil of coming from contribution, even if it is $100 paycheck at the end of the day, it could be an opportunity in the future. So, okay, well, I will move on. Oh, my last bullet point here, connecting the two parties. So generally too, in my experience, once I have helped a tenant find a place, usually then at that point, it's just connecting the seller and so I'm using seller, it's just ingrained in me, the landlord and the tenant to finish the paperwork from there. So it's really not much more involved beyond connecting the two parties. So, whatever application system the landlord has, they'll connect directly, or the property management company will connect directly with the tenant and take it from there. So if anyone else has had any other experience beyond that, let me know. But again, I've worked with a handful now, and that's always been the case. Okay. All right, so working with landlords, and then kind of back to Molitor. I mean, I feel like the bulk of Molitor's business is actually working with landlords who are looking to lease their property, which is a little bit more money that he can charge. And, probably a lot better use of his time, just like a listing is a much better use of your time in terms of not having to drive all around, showing homes or showing apartments. When you are listing property, you're able to control your time a lot better. So, the paperwork required here is the WB 37, the exclusive right to rent, and I'll show that to you guys. Again, the ABA disclosure, the KW disclosure, the EPA lead-based paint brochure that you could provide to a prospective tenant, the smoke and carbon monoxide detectors, another sheet that allows for the requirement of having smoke and carbon monoxide detectors in the home, a check-in sheet, a residential lease, and a tenant application. Now, some of this documentation you might not actually ever use. It just kind of depends on how little or how much you are assisting the landlord. So I'm going to go over back to zip forms. Go back. So the residential listing contract exclusive right to rent is here. And again, so this is just mimicking the exclusive right to sell contract. So owner gives the firm the exclusive right to rent the rental units located at, and just like the listing contract, you would put in the address at the top. Lines 12 through 16 allows you to describe, the units themselves. Maybe you are doing a maybe there's multiple units for sale at once. Put in the rent, putting in the security deposit, the minimum term, any additional terms, any exclusions again. So if the landlord, was in conversations with a potential tenant prior to you two connecting, he could make that an exclusion if they end up coming back around. Commission, here I would say your commission should be it's typically 1 month's rent of what the landlord wishes to charge. So if they're charging $3,000 per month, I would say your commission is $3,000. And then of this, you are compensating, typically what I'm seeing is 20% to the firm that brings the tenant. This is not set in stone though. So again, this is why, it does feel like the Wild West out there in terms of these kind of details. If you want to be more generous, you absolutely can be. And if you want to be less generous, like the $100, you absolutely can be. So, talk through that with us if you've got questions, but again, that's typically what I am seeing. Definitions, again, more the same disclosure to client and customer. The duties to a customer are laid out along with your additional duties as a fiduciary, duties to clients, and then multiple representation. So you have to indicate that as well here. Now this is where on lines 148 through 156, where this is where you can kind of pick and choose how involved or not involved you want to be. You're marketing the opportunity, of course, the rental opportunity, of course. But then here you can indicate what other services are you willing to provide. So you could solicit tenant applications. You can qualify and approve prospective tenants. You can negotiate rental agreements. You can receive on behalf of the owner application fees, earnest money, and security deposits. Actually, I'm going to backtrack and say you cannot do that. We're going to have you stop short of doing that. I did verify this morning. We're not, and I knew this answer, but we do not hold on to earnest money or security deposits involved with tenant and landlord transactions. You can execute written rental agreements on behalf of the owner or other. On 157, there's a note here. This is not a property management agreement, and this listing does not obligate the firm and its agents to perform any property management duties, including maintenance. So keep that in mind as well. I personally stop short here. I solicit tenant applications and I'm send out tenant applications to anybody who wants one. And I help qualify and approve prospective tenants. But then ultimately, once it's ultimately it's the landlord's decision on who they end up going with. But in some cases, I've made recommendations. I've, pulled in a lot of tenant applications. I've picked out what I think are the best prospects based off of a platform I'm going to show you guys that actually Demolitor told me about. And then, then this landlord is doing kind of their final check on whether or not they want to go with that tenant or not. Most oftentimes with just like follow-up phone calls with that potential tenant. All right, and then this is all term of the contract. And everybody signs. Any questions?
Well, what, are you gonna be talking about where to enter that into command or how that's entered as an opportunity?
I am, yes, I
Okay,
will.
cool.
Yes.
But then I was curious to know how you go about vetting potential tenants.
Yes, no, we'll get there. Yep.
Cool, thanks.
Back to other types of the other documentation. So, in the state of Wisconsin, tenants need to be given the EPA lead-based paint brochure. Again, and this is kind of conversations with the potential landlord. So, in my experience, the landlords that I have been working with have already, they're seasoned. So they know what, they know what documentation to provide to the tenant. They've got their own versions of a check-in sheet. They've got the smoke and carbon monoxide detector. They've got their own rental application. But we do have these things here if that landlord does not. So oftentimes, like this blank rental application, I think I received that from the landlord that I was working with a few years ago, and they had their own version. So I ended up using their version because that's what they were comfortable with. But there is one here, a WRA version that you could use as well. So the check-in sheet, once that tenant is procured for the landlord. Oh, I'm gonna go back. This could be provided. And again, this is after the tenant has already been procured. And then they're just going through and giving their comments regarding the condition of the premises when they moved in. And this helps with the security deposit release at the end of their tenancy. Again, the landlord that you are working with might already have their version of this. It's just a conversation with them. The tenant needs to receive the EPA lead-based paint brochure. Just here. Smoke and carbon monoxide detectors.
Is there, any parameters around when you have to present that brochure, or this doesn't matter what year the unit's built or anything like that?
I believe it's only for any before 1978 as well. But just like the addendum S, we're still filling, I mean, it's common practice that people are filling that out for post 1978 as well. I think it's just,
Yeah,
I would just be
just
providing it.
just give
I
it.
would be providing it to tenants who are actually, the tenants that are actually procured.
Okay, so that's what I was gonna ask next is like, do you give this stuff ahead of time before they've actually been vetted and selected, or is this while they're getting signed up or signed?
While they're getting signed up. Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. And then this is just assurance that smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors are in the home, and it lays out the tenant responsibilities for each. And then all parties sign it.
Can I ask a question about the showing of the units? Do you typically handle that, or do they set up showing times with the landlord?
Yes, I'm gonna get to that too. Kind of talk about in practice
Okay.
in a minute here. So then the residential lease is here. So there is a WRA version that you could provide to your tenant, and you could, or sorry, to your landlord if they don't have a copy. They can use this. Spells out utilities, security deposit, special conditions, the check-in sheet, the landlord's right to enter. You know, some of this, your landlord, the landlord that you're working with is going to want to review this and make changes depending on their practice. But again, they might have their own version of a lease that, and that is just fine. It's kind of hard to train on this because nothing is set in stone. So it's just a lot of conversations with how people have practiced in the past in terms of conversations with the owner. And the KW disclosure, the affiliated business disclosure, and then a copy of a rental application. That again, they could use. This is not a lease or a rental agreement.
Are you typically emailing this?
I would print out paper copies and then, well, here, we'll get into the practicing
Okay.
piece of it. So once you have, the listing contract signed, works the same way. You're gonna, actually, I'm gonna verify this. I don't know if there's a 48-hour rule to get it into MLS. It might be different, with rental in terms of what MLS requires. But you're gonna put it into MLS, of course. And then showing the property and hosting opens. So, you're gonna put a lockbox on there, just as you would with a listing. Anyone out there acting as a tenant representative can set up a showing the same way as they would if they're just showing a regular listing. And you know, in terms of how those showings are handled, you know, anybody who wants to see the property and is not working with a tenant representative, and which you will find that is going to be more often the case. Because just like a listing, all of these, sorry, the apartment listing also gets syndicated to like Zillow and apartmentfinder.com and realtor.com. So
Oh,
you're gonna,
really? Wow.
yes. So you're gonna be fielding a lot of phone calls from prospective tenants who are just looking on Zillow.com. And in the event of that, then someone's gonna need them to show the home, and that person is going to be you. So in my experience, I have found that the best way to handle that, I mean, I was running around so much showing property or showing properties to prospective tenants on behalf of my landlord. And I thought the best way to field all of that was to just set up set times to have the property open so that people could come in. I could have applications available. If they were interested, I would just give them an application on site and have them send it in to me. And I thought that was the best way to handle all of the prospective tenants who wanted to see a property. Otherwise, again, if somebody is setting something up through MLS, as an agent doing that, and they've got a tenant representative agreement with their tenant, and they will be accompanying their buyer. But we can't just let buyers go into the home, obviously, without someone there with them. And then again, that could also be a conversation with the landlord. Maybe it's a duty that you both share. The examples I'm most often citing, the landlords in these examples lived in California. So I was taking on all of the showings, and all of the opens, but the landlord does have the opportunity to do that as well. Qualifying tenants then. So I would provide rental applications. I would take in rental applications. And then I would use mysmartmove.com. And I'm not going to go through, again, this was a website that John Molitor told me about a few years ago. Pin. Okay. What did I have this? Oh. So let's screen your tenant. It kind of just walks you through. So who do you want to pay for the screening? The tenant or the you? And we would have the tenant pay for it. What I would like to get to is Thanks for your patience, guys. In the past, it would bring me to my dashboard, which has all of my potential apartments. Handing it to you, Joan.
Good.
This is. Kind of embarrassing. Sorry, this is not how this normally looks.
Well, isn't it pretty easy, self-directional when you get into it?
1,000%, yes.
Mm.
But
Is how much does it usually cost to screen that the tenant would have to pay?
I think it was 50.
50? Okay. Is
Mhm.
that something you typically put on the listing indicating that $50 cost for screening?
I would put that in the remarks, yeah.
Okay.
But like I took for granted that I thought that it would just lead me right to where um my simple home screen, tenant screening, credit checks, criminal background checks, eviction test. And we would just do the simple one.
What does it actually look at when you,
I mean, credit scores, and it gives a recommendation if they think based off of the report, if it's gonna be a good candidate. I mean, it's, I think it's just one variable to use
so
in
that's
terms of screening a tenant. So,
making sure they can pay is probably the most important.
yeah, I mean, it's the biggest thing that we're gaining from this.
Do they have
So
any fair housing rules as to how you're allowed to vet them or evaluate or decide on who is a tenant?
It's the same as residential sales,
Okay.
protected categories that you cannot either eliminate or only include.
Okay.
mhm. Well, I know that I had I see I lost a lot of people. Um, I know that there are landlords who, savvy landlords who, want a minimum credit score. And credit score is not a protected
Right.
class, so, um, they were just making their decisions based off of credit score, which is,
And then a C cap.
yeah.
Okay.
And then I've also take on the duty of calling and verifying employment. Um, again, I don't, it's all conversations with the landlord, they might not need you to do that.
They may be willing to take more risk.
Yeah,
When you call to verify employment, are you asking anything specific other than are they employed there and for how long?
no,
Okay.
so. But again, so my practice has always been there would be like 3 or 4 good choices. I would send those off to the landlord, and then they would do her preference was to call everybody and kind of just do a final conversation with them, and then she would make her decision. And then I would help with getting the leases signed. And if they wanted me to fill out the lease, I would absolutely do that. I would get it signed by all parties. Then at that point, I would send in the check-in sheet to the tenant along with the EPA brochure, and then that carbon monoxide check, sheet, excuse me.
I'm sorry, you might have already said this and I spaced it out, but is it kind of like a final walkthrough that you do with them to fill out that condition report?
They're doing it themselves. I'm not involved in that. I'm just providing the sheet and then they are getting it off to the landlord.
Oh, you're providing it to them and you tell them to turn it in to the landlord after they fill it out.
Yep.
So they've already gotten keys to the unit,
Yes.
paid their first month security deposit and all that. and that's when they fill it out.
Yes, and then I'm helping pass along details about where payments should be sent in. But again, that could be something that the landlord just handles themselves once they connect. You know, I think the best practice is to get as far as the highlighted bullet points here and then connect the two. I think would be, you know, there's just a lot of details that can, I feel like then we're entering into like property management realm. I mean, nothing that we're doing is under I mean, it is under property management per se, but like, you know, in terms of intake of rents and security deposits, you want those details to be worked out between the two parties. So, then in command, where did I go here? So we've got a landlord. Here we go. So Tammy, you know, you're going to create an opportunity the same way, but you're going to pick the landlord or the tenant opportunity type. And then you can see this is what, you know, these are really the basics. The residential listing contract is required, the MLS listing sheet. Kimmy is going to add the ABA disclosure and the KW disclosure as a requirement here.
Does there have to, does there have to be an MLS sheet? What if we found it through a connection with somebody? And we're still representing the tenant, but they were,
This is the landlord opportunity type. So you would have a sheet.
oh, okay, yeah. But if it were, yeah, the other way around, I guess we'll have to see.
Yeah, I'm pretty positive that's not a requirement.
Okay.
But as you can see, all of these are optional. So it's like what you end up using and what you end up not using. You know, dependent upon your conversations and the services that you have provided to the landlord. Because it might not be the case that you're filling out the residential lease. You know, the seller might just end up taking that on and you would never be privy to a copy of it. But if you have it, then we need to see it. Make sense?
Yep. And then, do we have to enter something for commissions?
Oh, yep. Let's see here.
We have to have a,
And we're gonna have a
Have to have
commission.
do you have to have an address in there?
And we're actually within that blackout period right now, with commissions.
Yeah, okay.
So we're gonna be doing this again, so I apologize. But yes, you fill out commissions the same way that you do with listed property.
And it's, is there a PAC charge? Or how do we figure out?
Not on, I almost positive no. I will verify.
And then, the system just calculates the splits on its own, right?
Yep.
Okay.
And then for the tenant. This information just doesn't flow off the tip of my tongue like other trainings. This is the first time we've done this. But here so there's really just the under contract folder here and the buyer agency agreement, or so actually that's the tenant agency agreement. And again, you'll see it's just kind of, at minimum, you would need the tenant representative agreement and the ABA and the KW disclosure. But like the last tenant that I worked with, that's all I had, because they ended up leasing at the Ascent, and the Ascent just took care of everything. Like they're, a major high-rise luxury building, and their people just take care of all of that. So
What do you submit to them that gives them any indication how they will pay you?
I gave them a copy of the tenant agreement.
Oh, okay. Do they have an acknowledgement spot on there? I didn't notice. The landlord, does the landlord have to acknowledge that agreement?
Uh,
Or you just send them a copy and then they take it and you hope they send a check?
yeah, I mean, it's, with this particular couple, I made it very clear that, you are agreeing to pay me, and if I can't, depending on where you end up leasing, oftentimes in these bigger apartment communities will compensate. And I didn't know what it was going to be, so like, let's say the Ascent was only going to agree to compensate me $500, and I would have collected the other $500 from the tenant. If the Ascent wasn't going to agree to pay me at all, then I was going to get that directly from the tenant, because I showed it to them.
Okay.
If they
Never
had,
gotten a payment directly from a person, so not sure how you go about having them submit it. Do you just ask them to write out a check to Keller Williams Lake Country and,
yep,
okay, and then put the property address or something like that on the memo line?
I'm a line, yep.
Okay,